So last weekend, I was over at my friend's house and I saw that she had this great little Craftsman style side table, a nice little project. And the second I saw it, I thought, oh, this is going to be great for like an intermediate woodworker. It's not too difficult. You don't need a ton of wood, and it's a real piece of furniture that somebody's actually had in their house for probably decades. So we drew it up, we've got a plan for how to do it, and now we just need the wood. And it just occurred to me that I have no idea if I have any oak at all. And this is Craftsman furniture. You have to make it out of oak. So that's pine. Oh, let me tell you about my lumber rack here real quick. This is really easy. These are heavy-duty, high-capacity shelf brackets just from Amazon. They were cheap, and I just screwed them to 2x6s that are lag-bolted into the masonry. We made this in a couple of hours, and it works fine. So that's pine up there. This is poplar over here. Okay, here we go. These are oak boards right here. 1, 2, and let's see. Do they come down? Yeah, they stick out the other end. So these boards are at least 6, 8 feet long. This is great. And then, oh, this is a scrap too. This is awesome. So one of the things that's good about this project is that it's pretty small. So even a little scrap of oak like this, I'm going to get like 2 legs out of this. So I can even use up some small stuff. I'm going to excavate one of these boards out of the pile, and we'll get straight to work making the top. The best plan for this piece is to make the whole thing out of a single board. That way I'm going to have consistent color for the whole thing. I hate to stain hardwood. Now I've divided the piece up into 2 12-inch sections. Those are going to give me my top, a 14-inch section because I need a little filler strip for the top, and then some cross braces, and then a 16-inch section for the legs. And I can get the whole piece out of those 3 sections, but I've got an additional 16 inches at the end of this board, and I'm going to need those because, let's be honest, I'm going to screw something up. I'm going to make the top out of these 2 pieces, and obviously this one's got too much damage on the edge. I need to get rid of that before I can put these 2 together. This is a great time to have an aggressive plane like my wooden 4-plane. This is going to let me get rid of that extra wood really quickly, even though I'm working in oak. And after I've taken several shavings, I've gotten rid of the damaged wood, but I can tell just by eye that the joint isn't square. I'm going to square that up with the 4-plane. I want to use the coarsest tool for as long as I can, and then finish that joint up with my finely set jack plane. Now I've got a pretty good joint here, and you might have noticed that I didn't prep the surfaces or use my winding sticks and flatten these boards at all. The reason is that once I have this top together, I'm going to plane the whole thing and flatten it as a single piece. As long as my boards are fairly short and pretty flat, they're fine for the glue up, and then I'll make the whole thing flat once it's together. These 2 pieces are pretty good. The only problem is that when I put them together and measure them, I only have 10.5 inches and I need 12. So I need to get an 1.5 inch strip off of this board and put it in the middle. I'm taking my filler strip off of this piece. I jack planed one edge, and that's allowed my gauge to run smoothly along it. And I've given myself 2 inches here, even though I only need 1.5 inches. I'm going to be jointing 3 pieces and fitting them together. And while I'm making those joints square, you can lose 1/2 inch very easily. So I've given myself a little bit of extra room to work with. And now all I have to do is use my rip saw and my saw bench to rip off this strip of wood. This piece is too short to hold with my knee. In fact, you might be better off in the vise. But this position does let me show you my favorite ripping technique. I've already got the kerf started, and what I want to do is lay the saw down next to my line at a very shallow angle. And that helps me get the kerf started. The kerf goes all the way back to there, and the saw is going to follow that kerf. So when I go up on a much steeper angle, I can make fast progress and not worry about getting off my line. And that's how I'm going to do the rest of the board. Shallow, next to the line. just to get a bit of curve established, and then power strokes more up and down. Both of these boards have a mixture of grain patterns in them. There's this flat grain here that comes from the middle of the tree, and then these straight lines that come more from the edge of the tree. This is called radial grain, but that's not important. Just pay attention to the way that it looks. If I put the straight lines on this board next to the flat grain of this board, and there's a little sapwood mixed in, you can see everything clashes. It's really terrible. If I rotate this board so that flat grain is next to flat grain, that's already a big improvement, especially under a coat of finish. That's going to look much better. But I also need to add that extra width to get the full top. So here's the filler piece I just got, and you can tell it's also got a mixture of flat grain and those straight radial grain lines. I've got straight radial grain over here, and it's kind of going in this direction, and I can match that up to my filler strip over here. They don't have to look perfect, especially here, unplaned and unfinished, but you want to match things up the best you can here. That's going to give you the best looking top. Once you like the orientation, draw a triangle like this. We're going to be jointing these edges and putting the pieces back together over and over again. Having that triangle makes it impossible to get the pieces mixed up, and we'll even use that for glue up. Jointing up short pieces like this is a great way to learn to make a glue joint. These pieces are actually shorter than my jack plane, and that makes them really easy. I just planed this edge a couple of times to take off the saw marks. Let me show you how I did that. Anytime I'm edge jointing, I use this, we call it the pinch grip. I'm literally pinching the toe of the plane, and then the nail of my index finger is going to ride against the side of the wood. That's going to keep the plane on track, and what I want is for the center of the iron right here to be centered on the wood. And so let me just take a very light shaving right there, and that's probably going to be good. I don't even need to use a straight edge or anything. Let's just see what happens. And I'm using my triangle here. That's letting me know these two pieces go together. A great way to test if you have a good joint is just to look down like this and see if there's any light coming through, and there isn't. Another test we can do is try to rotate the board. And if you feel a bit of resistance and it doesn't rotate easily, that's great. If you can just barely touch it and it does this, that means one of your boards is high in the middle. You need to take a couple of short strokes in the middle to bring that down. But I feel good resistance with these, so I don't have a hump in the middle of the joint. And the last thing I'll do is just check and see how flat we are. I don't expect perfect flatness because I didn't flatten the faces of these boards, but I'm using wood that's pretty flat from the mill, and when I put my straight edge across it, it's really quite flat. So I know that this is a good joint. This piece, my filler strip, has the base of my triangle on it, so I'm going to mate this piece here to this bottom piece, and then my top will be done, and we're ready to glue it up. To glue up the top of your table, you're just going to need a couple of inexpensive bar clamps, but maybe you don't even have inexpensive clamps. No problem. We really don't need many clamps for this build, and we definitely don't need any long clamps. Instead, we're just going to use our workbench as a clamp. I've built a really simple jig. I have one piece of wood right here that's been screwed down with 3 screws, so it's really solid. And then a second piece with only 1 screw, so it's free to rotate. And then I've also taken a wedge, just a piece of the same material, and I just planed a shallow angle into one side. When I go to glue this piece up, all I'm going to do is put my 3 pieces right here in between the stuff I've got screwed down, take my wedge, put it in front of this piece here, and tap it in with my hammer. And the trick is, because this piece is free to rotate back and forth, when I tap this wedge in, it automatically adjusts to the angle. That wedge tightens everything up against this other piece, and it gives me just as much pressure as clamping something. So this is a great system if you don't have clamps or if you have an awkward piece. And of course, I put a couple pieces of blue tape on the bench right where my glue seams are, and that's going to keep my piece from sticking to the bench top, because it's always super embarrassing when that happens. So I'll take that wedge out, and let's do this glue up right now. When I have a 3-piece glue up, I usually leave the center piece where it is, and just stand up the pieces on either side. Most people use too much glue in their glue ups. I've very rarely had a glue joint fail because I used too little. So I'll put a pretty fine bead of glue there, and I'm just gonna smooth that out with a fingertip. You don't need a brush or anything like that. And you wanna get that glue all the way to the edges, because if you have some tiny, tiny little gaps, the glue will fill that. They won't fill big gaps, but they will handle little ones. So when you have nice, even coverage of your glue that looks like that, you're ready to go. Clean the glue off your hand. This is one of those times where having that triangle on the wood is super helpful, because now the glue is on the wood and the clock is ticking, and I don't want to make any mistakes, but I see my triangle, so I know everything is in the correct orientation. I'm going to put my wedge in, I'm going to tap it in, and I'm seeing squeeze out of my glue, and I'm going to use my hammer to just even out where the wood is a little bit. I'm trying to make the top as flat and even as I can. I might have a little unevenness on the other side, but that's no problem because I'm going to plane it anyway, and the underside is the underside. It's a low table. Nobody's ever going to see it. This is giving me plenty of clamping pressure, and I can just leave this and walk away, and when I come back tomorrow, my top will be ready for processing. This little table has 2 stretchers and 4 legs, and the next thing I want to do is cut out all of those pieces. Now, with the legs and the stretchers, they're really on full display because they go around the outside of the piece, and I have to cut joinery into them. So I don't want to just hack up a bunch of pieces of wood and then spend the rest of the day dimensioning them and trying to get them to look clean. What I'd like to do is work with my stock as much as I can when it's in large pieces like this, and try to have each stick come off of the board mostly ready for joinery, ready to be used in the piece. So I have this piece, and I used this to cut off that filler strip that I used in the top, so it's got 2 rough edges and it's got rough face still from the mill. Before I do anything else, I want to straighten this piece out on at least 2 faces, but probably 3. So I'm going to take my jack plane and back it off for a very fine cut. Try to read the grain. I was also going against it, so that wasn't helping. Here we go. So there's one face nicely planed. Since it's a short, small board, I'm just going to test it for flat against my workbench. No need for winding sticks or anything. This piece is pretty flat. So now I'm going to rotate and do the other side. And this piece is much worse. It's going to need more planing. I don't know if you can hear the plane skipping, and it's because the machine planer took a very heavy cut on this, and it's a very undulating surface. And that would really show up in the finished piece. We need to take the time to get those undulations out of the wood before we do anything else with it. Now I'm getting nice, clean, long shavings, and that side's looking nice. I'm going to give one side a face mark because that's just helpful with layout. And then I have this surface here, which I rip-sawed, so it's rough. And what I'd like to do is go ahead and square that up right now. Jack plane is still pretty finely set. Deepen the cut slightly. And you can hear it's just hitting here and here. So it's hollow in the middle. That's fine, but paying attention to those various sounds is really helpful in knowing what's going on with the wood. There we go. That was my first full-length shaving. And now I'll use the square against the face side and test it, and we're quite out of square. We're high on the side that's closer to you, so I'm going to use my pinch grip. I'm going to hold the plane over on that side, take a couple of shavings, using the camber of the iron to take away more on that side. Then we'll use the same pinch grip, but go to the center of the board. take 1, 2 shavings, and we'll test again. We're much, much closer to being square there, but it needs a tiny bit more. Same thing, pinch grip. Over to the side where it's too high. 1 shaving should do it. Go across like that. Register against the face, and that is a perfectly clean edge, and it's straight to my face. Next thing to do is mark out my leg. The legs and stretchers are all the same, so this is stretcher stock, but it doesn't matter, it could be a leg. I want square stock, so instead of measuring, I'm gonna set the gauge to the stock itself, and this gauge is set a little bit long. Micro adjust by tapping on the bench until the point just touches the edge. And that's it. And now I'm going to register the gauge against that line that I just planed. That's going to give me a smooth line. Put it against my planing stop and push forward. Light pass the first time and the second time. And as I get to the bottom of my gauging stroke, you can see that I have the wood angled up. That keeps the gauge from knocking on the bench top. So, several light passes, and then since I just did it and I can see my line, can I? Yes. Very difficult to see a gauge line in oak and other pale woods. So just darkening it with the pencil, it's nice when I'm filming, but it's nice even when I'm not filming. And it's really helpful to have that gauge line on both sides. I'll show you why a little later. So same thing. Three passes is usually plenty. And then darken that in with the pencil. Now I'm ready to rip this piece, and the best thing to do is rip it in the vise. It's really too short for the saw bench. When I put a piece like this in an inexpensive vise, the problem is I can only hold it on the side and I get a lot of racking. The vise closes up over here, and that causes the piece to not be held very well. There's a lot of shop-made solutions to this, but my company Compass Rose just came out with this thing. We call it a vise block, and it just goes right into your vise like that. I need to loosen this up a tiny bit. It goes right into your vise, and then you tighten, and it equalizes the pressure in the vise, and it holds your piece way more securely. Before I go to actually rip this piece, I'm going to put a square right next to my gauge line and connect my line across the top. That's going to help me start square. And when you're doing a rip cut like this, it's really helpful if your saw is at an angle. That lets you track your gauge line much better. That's why I favor the saw bench, but can't do that with a piece this small. There's no way to kneel on it, and I really don't like clamping stuff to the saw bench. If it's that small, just use the vise, but you can't get that angle. Well, there's a great trick for this. We'll start by just getting a kerf across the top, and I'm cutting right to the side of my line so I can plane down to it later. Once my cut is established and I know I'm nice and square, the right thing to do is actually just to kneel down. I got this trick from Joshua Klein, who runs Mortise and Tenon magazine, and it is a wonderful way to do your rip cut while getting the angle that you want. I can see my line clearly, and I can lay down that kerf right next to the line so I won't drift off. The piece is a little low in the vise, so I'm just going to adjust it up a bit. You often start it with the piece a little low, and then you move it up to get going. So I just made a mistake that you should watch out for. I got halfway done with my rip cut, and I rotated the piece to start from the other side because the piece is really short. But then I started my second rip cut on the wrong side of the line. So you can see I cut into the stock that I wanted to keep. Unfortunately, this sort of thing happens all the time. You should really pay attention to it. I've made this mistake so many times, and here I just made it again. So I've replaned, and I'm going to re-gauge my line, and we're going to rip this piece again, because that's all you can do. Okay. Now I've made the rip cut correctly. Because I prepared my stock before I did the cutting, I've only got this one sawn edge to worry about. And because I gauged and penciled in my lines on both sides, I can plane down to those lines. And I don't even have to worry about square. It's going to be square. And this piece is going to be done. This is a great way to prep small pieces. Now I've got to do 5 more of these cuts, and my elbow is already talking back to me a little bit. So I'm going to make the other rip cuts over on the bandsaw, but the technique is still going to be exactly the same. Plane one edge, flatten square, gauge my lines off of that edge, make the cut, and then when the cuts are all done, I just have one edge to plane off. A bandsaw makes this sort of thing much quicker and easier, but of course, you might not have one. If you'd like to add a little power to your hand tool shop, think about picking up a good jigsaw. For a project like this, they do basically the same thing, rip cuts and curves, and they're so much smaller and safer and less expensive. Now that our legs and stretchers are made, there's only one more component. On the original table, the top has a cleat screwed to the underside, and you can tell from the color of the different woods that the cleat was added later, probably because that top started bending and flexing with the seasons. You would expect that. It's a big piece of timber with the legs attached at the outside. There's nothing to keep it from bowing and flexing. So somebody came back after the original builder and added that cleat. We're going to go ahead and put that in right now. The piece of wood that I used to create my stretchers still had just enough wood to squeeze out one more piece. This is going to be our cleat. It's just under 1 foot long and 1.25 inches wide. In the original piece, it has a nice gentle curve, which makes the ends narrow and hard to see from the top, and we're going to include that detail in ours. But drawing big curves can be tricky. We need an accessible way of doing that. An easy way to make curves is this thing. It's called a curve bow. It's just a thin scrap of wood, something that's nice and flexible. Walnut's a good choice. And I'm just going to use a string to get it to hold the curve that I want. I drilled a hole through one end and knotted the string and stuck it through. And then on the other end, I sawed a notch. And I've tied several knots in the other end of this string so I can flex the bow and just pull one of these knots up into the notch, and all of a sudden our curve bow is holding a nice shape. If I put this against my piece of wood, I can see, okay, this curve isn't exactly what I'm looking for because it comes up short of either end. If I do this curve, I'll end up cutting off half the piece. So I need a gentler curve. I can ease this thing back one knot, and that's a much gentler, smoother curve. This is much more what I'm looking for. It's just going to relieve those ends a little bit. So a curve like this doesn't have to be ultra precise. You can line it up by eye. I'm going to put the bottom of the curve bow against the bottom of my cleat and then just line up the ends so that I'm taking off the same amount of material. And then it's simple to just trace that. And then I can shape it. And of course, you could rough out that curve with a scrub plane or a 4-plane, but boy, using the hewing hatchet sure is more fun, and honestly, it's quicker. Once your curves are roughed out, I suggest finishing with a spoke shave. Spoke shaves are great for doing curves. Even a flat bottom spoke shave will do a nice job on an outside curve. I made this spoke shave, well, I dated it right here on the end. It says 2019. I can't believe it. It seems like yesterday, but this tool is 5 years old and still works like a charm. When I make long components, like my legs and stretchers, I always make them longer than I need. So this is my stretcher. I need 13 inches, but I've left it 14 inches. Not only does that allow you to trim it down to the perfect length, it can also help you fix flaws. Both of these pieces are not just a little bit longer than they need to be, but they're also a tiny bit narrower on one end. I didn't plane them perfectly square. This is a great opportunity to take a little bit of length off that end, and that's going to help me correct that discrepancy in thickness. So I've marked those narrower ends. I'm going to cut both those off. And before I cut anything off, I want to start with nice clean end grain. I'm going to go to the other end, and you can see it's still ragged from the saw. I want to clean that up. Instead of using a shooting board, I'm just using bench hooks. I often use these for really small shooting tasks. So with the piece over like this, I'm going to turn it at an angle, put it just over the edge of the hook, just like that, and give it a couple quick strokes with the plane. Doing that's going to give me a little bit of a bevel on the end grain right here. I'm going to take that beveled part and roll it to the back and place that beveled part against the fence and shoot. That bevel helps protect me from breakout, and now I have nice, clean end grain. And that's going to give me a place to measure from, because I don't need to do anything else to this end. So I'm going to measure from the end I just shot, and I'm going to keep the tape parallel to the edge of the piece and mark myself a line at 13. Put it in the orientation that I'm going to work with it, and strike a line across the top, roll it forward, and strike another line that I can see. My cut line goes around 2 faces, and that's quite important. With my line marked, I'm also going to use the bench hooks to cut it. I can see the line on top and also facing me. And for a cut this size, I will use a dovetail saw. They're super easy to control. Line up, start my cut, kerf all the way across the top of the piece, and then I usually move the piece out a bit. And drop my saw as I go to proceed on 2 lines and get a square cut. Excellent. That's just going to need a tiny bit of shooting, and this piece is going to be the perfect length, nice and clean. I don't want to measure the 2 pieces. I want to make one exactly right. Super light shooting will clean up that end grain, and then I'll use the piece that I just trimmed against my other piece and mark it directly. This is much better than measuring a second time. If I do it like this, I can't make a mistake. And now, after shooting, I have 2 pieces that are exactly the same length, and they're ready for joinery. My legs have already been trimmed to their exact length, and the ends just need a quick shooting, and these are going to be ready to join as well. Before I cut the joinery in my legs, the last step is to bevel or chamfer the end of each leg. And I can do that with a knife, a chisel, a hand plane. All of those will work, but end grain red oak is very chippy, and doing it with a blade is a little bit risky. I've already put a lot of work into these components, and to blow out a corner right now would be really inconvenient. So instead, I'm just going to use metal files. They work just as well, and there's very little risk of damaging the wood. This is a coarse double cut file, and hold on, I need to turn the leg towards me because I already finished that bevel. There we are. So this is a coarse double cut metal file. It's got quite aggressive teeth, and it's going to let me rough in my bevel. Just took a few strokes, and I can get the angle and the width of the bevel by eye. Now I'm going to move over to this fine single cut mill file. Metal files are often better for woodworking, even though they're less aggressive than wood rasps, because they're so affordable. These came from the flea market. This one still has the price on it. You can see right here. It was $5. That's an amazing price for a Nicholson Made in USA file. And this file allows me to come in with just a couple of circular strokes, and it takes away the file marks that I left with that double cut file and gives me a beautiful finished surface. And then it's just repeat. You can see now I have a nice chamfer all the way around that end grain. And the chamfer actually serves two purposes. On the bottom of the piece, we chamfer the leg because it slides around on the floor and that can chip out the sides. The chamfer will keep that from happening. On the top of the leg, the chamfer is mostly decorative, but it also makes the table much nicer to hold. For your clients, you really don't want to leave any sharp edges. That makes your furniture feel unpleasant. My viewers have been asking for slower, more detailed videos on small, approachable woodworking projects. So this week we did things a little bit differently. Instead of building the whole project and then cutting together a tight 10-minute edit, I did things live on camera. You saw me make each piece, make some mistakes, recover from mistakes, and hopefully there was much more detail and a lot more information. It was fun to shoot this way. Let me know down in the comments if you like it and if you'd like to see more videos like this. Another thing we did differently is we're going to split this video up into two parts. In this video, I made all the components. 1 cleat, 2 stretchers, 4 legs, and the top. And you might have noticed that I didn't cut the top to size or make it round yet. That's because I haven't put together the legs and the undercarriage of the table, and I'm not 100% sure what size that top is going to need to be. By leaving it this size, I have a lot of flexibility later in the build. Now, the original table was made with screws, and I don't want to throw any shade on screws, but they're terrible. And we're going to replace half of those joints with actual joinery. I've got a simple, super strong, attractive joint you can use that's going to be the perfect fit for this project. And if you're a regular viewer to this channel, I bet you can guess which joint we're going to use. So join us next week when we put the entire table together, cut the top, assemble the whole thing, and finish it. Next week, we're also going to have a complete set of plans, super detailed and super affordable, unless you're a patron, in which case those plans are free. In fact, my patrons get all of my plans for free. If you'd like to get free plans and a bunch of other extras, go on over to patreon.com/RexKrueger and check out all the rewards we have for the people who make these videos possible. You can also go to compassrosetools.com to check out our brand new vise block and our complete line of woodworking tools. Complete line is probably overselling it. I think we have 5 tools, but 5's not bad for a scrappy little company. Go on over to Compass Rose and check out the stuff we have. We probably have something that'll be right at home in your shop. We'll see you next week with the remainder of this project, and we can't wait. Thanks for watching.